Welcome to Digital Currents, brought to you by Morgan Creek Digital. I'm Xavier Segura. Each episode, we spotlight the topics and people changing the tech industry with a focus on AI, blockchain, chips, and big data. Thanks for listening, and please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Digital Currents. Mark, we took a little bit of a summer break and we couldn't have picked a better time to come back.
Unbelievable. I mean, it does feel like forever, but it's only been a couple weeks. Though we had a great show to fill in on stablecoins, which everyone should take a listen to. But look, today is a big show. Look, I'm prone to hyperbole. Yeah. But this is big. I mean, while we were sleeping last night, Bitcoin hit a new all-time high above 118,000. Mm-hmm. So that's sink in for a second. And look, we did our matching thing. Again, we don't talk about this. It's kind of amazing. We're on the same wavelength. Other than your hair is much darker than mine. But it's too hot in North Carolina today to wear long pants. I am wearing pants, but shorts. But I will do a sock reveal. So, and what better than Bitcoin bull? The bull is back on an island, summertime feel, but the bull is back. When you look at, again, all of the history of these cycles, you say, well, why does this cycle have to repeat? Well, humans are going to human. That's the way things do. We have a business cycle. We have an economic cycle. We have a Bitcoin cycle. Now, the Bitcoin cycle is hard-coded in the sense that it revolves around the halving. But what's amazing to me is the consensus coming into the year. If you go back to January and look at our shows, the consensus coming into the year was we were going to have a dip right into the low 70s. And actually, the actual number that was the consensus was 72K. And, we immediately started dropping. And to your point, the boo birds came out and they were, it's going to zero. Like, it's not going to zero. I mean, that's a dumb statement at this point. But there are people say, it's going back to 50, it's going back to the pre-halving price in the 40s. Like, no, I mean, nothing points to that. We literally hit the 72 number. And then we headed back up. And there is this normal consolidation pattern from kind of May through July, which is what we've been in. And then in that kind of first week of July, historically, you get this move. Now, it doesn't mean we're going straight up from here to 150. They'll probably be, we got a little overbought last night. So, but, it's funny. I again, lots of props today. So I have the GM, from my buddy up in New York with Morgan Creek, but it's got the Bitcoin on the back. So I changed my mug from my usual, stoneware that my wife likes. But today is a day to celebrate Bitcoin, celebrate the achievement of this milestone. But I think what's really interesting, the debate and the conversation we should have around this is cycles versus a transition. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in the previous cycles, we've had this boom bust, kind of the FOMO, kind of leveraged, blow off parabolic top and then crash. And we had an 84% crash, an 84% crash, 72% crash. This time, there are those, and I'm probably not in this camp, but I'm sympathetic to the point that there's so much demand from institutions as opposed to retail. And that's the ETFs, that's the, big individuals like right. Paul Tudor Jones or Stan Druckenmiller, billionaires who are buying it like an institution, and or the institutions themselves, like a Harvard or a Stanford or whoever. Plus, you have the whole Bitcoin treasury phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Companies like MicroStrategy, now Strategy, and MetaPlanet, and Smarter Web Company, and the Blockchain Group in France. All of these companies, there's 137 now, that are every day or every week or every month buying Bitcoin, issuing shares, buying more Bitcoin. And I think, collectively, they bought like 10x the available supply this week. So if you look at the ETFs and these Bitcoin treasury companies, they bought 10 times the available supply. Well, where's that supply coming from? Well, it's coming from exchanges. It's coming from some of the OGs or selling a few coins. But at the end of the day, if there's a supply-demand imbalance, prices will rise. And so I am sympathetic to this idea that there could be a new era where we have lower volatility as opposed to higher and more stable accumulation, like an accumulation pattern. So I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think that, Mark, there's so much here at play. And I'm glad you brought up a couple of things about, like, this is not necessarily just retail driven, because if you kind of look at some of this growth and accumulation pattern, different from some of the other all-time highs that we've had, sometimes Bitcoin has stood alone, right, in sort of driving the pack. But now you're seeing ETH was flirting with 3,000. Oh, they're coming back. But then also the miners have started doing well in the public stocks. They had gotten hammered before, and they had even started transitioning their business models into AI because they had to figure out a way to become more profitable. But I think, in the end, we are starting to see just, since Wednesday, a massive accumulation in the ETFs, which has just been, one of the great passages that we've seen, again, in this era, because it allows for that easy facility of, entry into Bitcoin. And we're seeing who is buying this. And we put up a chart a couple of weeks back where it was like the $1 million prediction that ARK had, Mark, if you remember. And we kind of broke apart who was buying in their analysis. And so you're really seeing, a whole host of folks that were the largest asset managers in the world. And now this is, I would say, I'm not going to call it the new asset. This is the quickly appreciating play that all of these top asset managers are going towards, whether it's insurance companies, whether it's pension funds, whether it's sovereign wealth. And now we're seeing, direct treasury. So I think also what happens, Mark, is you're going to experience some of the natural phenomenon that happens within capital markets. So you're going to get herding. You're going to get this kind of FOMO effect about people kind of chasing. Well, we speak about the round number fallacy, right? People want to get to that 120, and then you might have like a little bit of a pullback. So it's definitely one of those things where maybe into the summertime is a little bit different from what we've kind of seen before in the past, which might support some of the ideas that we're saying that this is, a greater institutional adoption. But hey, I think it's a pretty crazy time if we step back and we kind of pull some of these threads where failing companies, let's call some of these shells companies what they are. They were failing companies.
Oh, for sure.
And they have embraced this idea of a invented digital currency where somebody just went on their computer, said, "Hey, I'm going to make money today," right? Using a whole new way of doing that in Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he, she, they are. And it's kind of proven to be this rallying cry, this phoenix rising from the ashes. And even we're seeing now stronger companies are starting to adopt this, and they're not getting laughed out of the room. And I think that more than anything, Mark, it really signals what you're talking about, that this is not retail. This is institutional. And you're going to need that to sustain that 6-figure price tag on Bitcoin.
Yeah, really important. And, there's another element here that, look, the maxis will eschew this, right? They'll poo-poo it, and they'll say, "Oh no, that's not real Bitcoin. You don't own Bitcoin. If you buy IBIT or if you buy, one of the ETFs, you don't own Bitcoin. Larry owns it. BlackRock owns it." Yep, fine, true. But here's the thing: the ease of buying an ETF and putting in your retirement account or putting in your brokerage account and having someone else take care of the custody of that bearer asset. Because remember, we all know the stories of people forgetting their password or forgetting their seed phrase and losing their coins, or the kid that might, we had I think I've told the story, one of our sales guy's son was at college up in New York, and he was one of the earliest, like literally 2009, 10 kind of people who was mining it on his laptop, his computer plugged into the university, kind of stealing power from the university. I mean, stealing is a little strong. Long story short, I mean, had thousands of Bitcoin, and the hard drive crashed.
Wow.
Literally, the hard drive crashed.
And that's probably a statistic, right, Mark? Because it's estimated, according to our friends at Legends in 2025, between 2 and 4 million Bitcoins just gone. And we were talking
gone and can never be retrieved. And look, they tried everything. They sent the computer to the NSA, who claimed, oh, we can't find anything. I'm like, did they actually find it and say they couldn't find it? No, I'm just kidding. I don't think they would do that. But long story short is there is still a UI UX issue to get us to where the vision is, right? Which is BYOB isn't, bring your own booze or whatever, it's be your own bank. And look, this is a real headline. This is a real headline from the New York Times. No, you don't actually have a right to a bank account. If that doesn't literally make your skin crawl, make you nervous, what do you mean I don't have a right to a bank account? What it's saying is the banks have the right to debank you. The banks have the right to seize. Oh, wait, it's not even your money. Once you give it to the bank, it's their money. And we have an IOU. But what they're saying is you don't even have a right to claim that IOU because we can just decide capriciously that you are unbankable. And so that's a society, again, it's worked for 838 years, fine, kinda. I mean, a few people got debanked, and if you were in a fringe area like, cannabis, it was tough to get a bank account. But the issue for me is at some point, we will all be sovereign individuals. We will hold our own keys. We will hold our own coins, and we will exchange Bitcoin as currency. But that requires a couple things. It requires size, right? You can't have a global currency at $1 billion market cap, right? It just doesn't work, right? Commerce is bigger than that. You can't even do it at 2 trillion. As crazy as it seems. I tweeted out this morning, Bitcoin is climbing the ladder. I gave a presentation last night on my Around the World kind of monthly thing. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin was in 6th place. It had just passed Google to become 6th, right behind Amazon. Overnight, while I was sleeping, it passed Amazon. It climbed the ladder into 5th place. It's the 5th largest asset in the world. Wow. Gold's number 1, okay? And then NVIDIA, and then Microsoft, and then Amazon, and then Bitcoin. And you're like, whoa, hold on a second. But at 2-point-something trillion, it's still not big enough to be the global reserve currency. Mm-hmm. So how big does it have to get? Well, it at least has to be as big as gold, because gold is the reserve asset. It's not the reserve currency. That's the dollar. And the dollar is bigger. And so it will eventually get there. And then the volatility will go from 80 to 60 to 40 to 20. The dollar, right, doesn't have no volatility. The dollar right now, the US dollar, relative to other currencies around the world, is having its worst year in the modern era. It's down 10.8% year to date. It's never done that in 100 years. So that's bad. But no one's saying, oh, we got to chuck that. It's too volatile. Well, no, things move relative to one another. And ultimately, but 10% isn't 80% or 100%. It's 10%. And so I think what's going to happen is incrementally, we're just going to keep climbing this ladder. Bitcoin will pass Amazon. It will pass Microsoft. It will pass NVIDIA. NVIDIA might pass it on the way down, but it will pass NVIDIA. And then it will catch gold. And at some point, and this is where, we should bring Murray on as a guest.
Absolutely.
So, Murray Stahl runs this firm Horizon Kinetics in New York. And I would say he's the only guy I've met who makes me sound bearish. Like he makes me seem like I'm Warren Buffett on Bitcoin, like super bearish. Because
so I guess I need like Charlie, right?
Yeah, digital gold, easy. He's like, Mark, no. This is going to displace everything. Reverse Gresham's law. This is perfect money. This is going to displace everything. And that's $100 trillion of value. At that point, we will carry some around on our wallet all the time.
Yeah.
We will swap digital assets, not paper currencies or credit cards.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel bad, kind of, for Visa and MasterCard because they will go away.
Well, to the staff,
no, Mark, they can't go away. They can't go away.
Yeah.
Sure they can.
And the staff that supports that, Mark, is kind of what you were saying with a little bit of the worry that, is Bitcoin really going to become Larry coin? And we joke with Larry Fink, in owning everything. But the stat that I was also really blown away in preparing for the episode was that, Mark, this is the third consecutive quarter in a row that more companies are buying BTC than ETFs. Right. And that's really the tipping point. Once you realize that public companies acquired 131,000 coins in the second quarter, they grew their Bitcoin balance 18%. And if you look at ETFs, they had 111,000, big number, but that was only an 8% increase over the same period. So what this is showing is that you have a big pool, and obviously the treasury companies are leading the pack here, which, creates access. But there are many other companies, and in the end, I would like to say that in the corporate world, sometimes they are bereft of creativity, Mark. And so, to put it lightly. So when one really good CIO or one really good CFO comes up with an idea, they'll probably just get hired away to their competitor for a little bit more money to replicate the same exact idea. So
and then the creativity gets beaten out of institutions, bureaucracies.
Yeah.
And it's just the way it works. I mean, I tell the story of, and people have probably heard it, the monkeys. And this is pre-PETA, right? But they put 5 monkeys in a cage and they put a bunch of bananas up there. And every time the monkeys would try to get the bananas, they'd blast them with a fire hose. And eventually the monkeys would stop going for the bananas. So then they'd pull one of the monkeys out and they'd put another one in who'd never been hit with a hose, and he'd try to go for the bananas. And the other monkeys would try to stop him, literally stop him from getting the bananas because they didn't want to get hit by the fire hose. And eventually they replaced all 5 monkeys. And eventually there are 5 monkeys who've never been hit with a hose who won't go for the bananas. And you say, what? Because we've always done it that way. That's just what, and no one ever asked the question, why won't you get the bananas? Because they'll hit us with a hose. They never, they couldn't talk, but I mean, maybe they can, maybe we just can't understand it. But this idea that, well, it's always got to be this way. We have to have bank accounts. No, we actually don't. And we have to use Visa and MasterCard. Well, no, we don't. And we haven't talked about stable coins, which is a monster topic that we could spend, the rest of the show on. But I think this is a celebration of the Bitcoin all-time high. There's probably other things we want to talk about in terms of the ECDs, but I just get so excited because we're in the trenches every day and we're talking to people making incremental progress, incremental technology changes, whether it's, changes in chip technology or applications of blockchain technology or changes in AI tools or AI agents or, the AI. But let's talk about AI for just one second. So,
do it.
The new iPhone promised Apple Intelligence, right? AI. And now when I do a search, it says AI thinking, and it produces not just garbage. It's mostly garbage, but it's not as bad as it was a month ago or 2 months ago or 5 months ago. But it's learning and it's getting a little bit better. It's still doesn't do what we've talked about, which is after you and I have a conversation and it hears that I need such and such. Why doesn't it go do that? Well, because it hadn't figured out how to do that yet, but it will. And so we see the incremental changes, but when you're in it, right, you don't sometimes see or appreciate the big changes. And I think 15 years in, we are at a seminal time for Bitcoin. I think the aha moment is happening at an increasing rate, right? You and I had it a while ago, and there were people before us that had it. And, I wish I had it in 2009. I just didn't. I was joking. I'm not a cryptography student, wasn't running drugs on Silk Road. I just didn't get the exposure to it. And even when I got the exposure, I was skeptical, which is logical. So it's okay to be skeptical of new technology. But now the accelerating pace of that aha moment, where, I went on family vacation last week, and, my son and daughter-in-law, we're talking, not all the time, but while we're walking on the trail in Yosemite, we're talking about Bitcoin.
Naturally.
We're talking, and then the other thing we were talking about Metaplanet, which, is, so, but that's interesting, right? We wouldn't have talked about that a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And it's, and she, and my daughter-in-law is moving up the ranks at this gigantic behemoth of a bureaucracy, PG&E.
Excellent.
And she's now director of strategy. And they're starting to talk about payment systems, and it's probably more stable coin than Bitcoin based, but still, for a monster company to be talking about, is there a better way? Is there a more efficient way? Is there a better way to use technology? And look, they're the least likely to be early adopters, right?
Yeah,
but
and I think, part of the thing you mentioned also is like, with some of these companies really looking at alternative payment systems and kind of getting a little bit more comfortable there, we would be remiss, Mark, without talking about kind of the latest week. And let me just be front and center with my biases, is that I hate when people dub something a week. Like, I hate tech week. I hate restaurant week, because listen,
hate them.
I always don't want to have this FOMO feeling. And I think like every week should be restaurant week. If you're so inclined to go get a nice meal with somebody that you care about, or somebody you're trying to get to know, fabulous. If you want to, get more involved in technology, I don't need to have a difficulty in scheduling in that particular week. But we are coming up on Crypto Week, Mark, in the U.S. Capitol, right? In our lawmakers, and so this is probably kind of affect your family, my family as well. Members are expected to vote on the Genius Act, to your point about stable coins, and it's also expected to consider the Digital Asset Market Clarity Act. So mouthful there, right? And the idea is it'll create more framework for crypto regulation, and it's just this idea of now talking about it, right? You mentioned you're talking about this in your vacation, in your leisure time. So there's really less, maybe it's a little different for us because, we're very much in love with what we do and entrepreneurs in that sense. But when you start bleeding that distinction between the work life and the personal life, you have really crossed this chasm and have gotten to a whole nother category. So this legitimizing of digital assets by things like, our elected officials or our companies, the most respected ones, are driving some of this growth that we're seeing. And I think, obviously we can be set up for some bit of a correction, and you're going to have a contingent of people that will be calling for a nadir and trying to figure out, where's the bottom, or, those that are always going to be the laggards. But, if we're thinking about that idea that you mentioned, Mark, on stable coins, it'll be very interesting, in my opinion, because yes, I do think that, Bitcoin is the rising tide that lifts all boats. But in some ways, stablecoins are orthogonal to Bitcoin, right? So stablecoins should more closely mirror what is happening with the broader U.S. financial system. And I know you're going to chuckle, Mark, with this, but the latest projection is that we're going to have 2 rate cuts this year. We shall see if that happens. But if that occurs, that could be, good thing for something like Bitcoin, where, it's an accumulation asset, and potentially a bad thing for something like a stable coin. But what will happen, because the idea that you'll have less yield potentially, and people will be looking for other instruments, just in terms of a bear asset. But I think in the end, stable coins have reached another kind of use case where people are thinking about them less as a way to, earn money and more as a way to save money. Either that's through remittances or through reducing fees on payments. But, in the end, I think they kind of serve two different functions. But at the end of the day, they're still really governed by the principles set out by Satoshi. And I don't really hear as much, of a swan song being sung by, you mentioned, but for the likes of Visa and MasterCard, who will, at the end of the day, be forced to adopt their own stablecoin or go the way of Blockbuster, failing to acquire.
No, then they're gone. They're gone. And look, I'm not saying necessarily that Circle and Tether and companies like that will absolutely defeat MasterCard and Visa. MasterCard and Visa still could, if they reacted quickly, they could stem the tide, but it's not usually incumbents that do that.
Yeah, very
right. It's just not their nature to change, because Blockbuster is a great example. Blockbuster owned us, right? We used to get in our cars and drive to the physical place.
That wasn't,
we trusted the brand, right? We trusted the brand. So all they had to do was say, well, just go to our website and download the movie instead of coming into the store. But they didn't do it. Well, why did they let Netflix do it, which was a nascent brand, unheard of brand, and actually a really crappy company when they first started? They'd mail you the DVDs and they'd be broken, and then they got lost and they'd charge you, and it was just bad. Almost went bankrupt twice, but now it's a meme stock. I mean, it just goes up every day. So I think the likelihood that an incumbent does get smart and fight against the tide, I wouldn't bet on that. I would bet against it. But I think, like, Coinbase is a great example. Coinbase just made a new all-time high yesterday, and that included a big dip after the IPO. It IPO'd, it went up, and then it crashed. It went down 75-ish%. And people were saying, "Oh, see, it's just a shitcoin casino and it's going away." No, I think Coinbase is one of the what Fab 4, Fab 5. Like today we have 4 big banks, right? Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citibank, maybe Wells Fargo, maybe it's the Fab 5. So I think Coinbase is, now, could JP Morgan or somebody buy them and make it part of their brand? They could, but I don't think they will, because I don't think Brian's going to sell. It's kind of like Circle, right? So Circle, the guy spun out of Goldman Sachs and they start this business and everybody says, "Oh, that's stupid. It'll never work." And it just quietly, and look, everyone knows I'm not a Brad Garlinghouse fan, and I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm just not. But because of the way he did what he did with XRP, yet it's up. And I told you it was up. Like, great. It went from 220 to 265. Knock yourselves out. But he did start to do something interesting in the last year or so, where he took this highly inflated asset, that he really created from nothing. It was just a ICO. And he owns a bunch of it. And started buying real businesses with an inflated currency. It's kind of what CoreWeave is doing with Core Scientific, right? CoreWeave was going to buy, it was with a Core Scientific was going to provide CoreWeave with a bunch of services, and they were going to have to pay them $10 billion a year. And they said, well, we'll just buy you for $8 billion. And that's a good thing. So you take your inflated stock and you buy an asset and you arbitrage the difference. And so Brad came in and said, all right, Circle, I'll pay you $8 billion. And, Jeremy was like, ha, yeah, you wish. And everybody's like, no, that's a big number. It was only worth a couple billion. And he's offering you 8. Like, no. And literally a week later, he doubled the bid to 16. And everybody's like, oh my God, maybe they should take it. And Jeremy's like, no. So then they go public and they go from 16 to 80. Okay. No, I'm sorry. From 10, they went public at 10 to 80. They went up 8 times in a matter of weeks. Now they've fallen back and they're only 50, but that's a lot bigger than 16.
And right, Mark, this is all about power. And I mean, no pun intended, but the quote that I thought was the money quote from some of the onlookers, right? So you had CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, saying that, that Microsoft is no longer chip constrained. It is power constrained. And so, why does this set up very nicely for CoreWeave? Because at the end of the day, CoreWeave doesn't own anything, right? They're just providing services over to Core owns its power infrastructure. 1 gigawatt is really their data center footprint. And that inclusive of to your point, the huge price tag, 840 megawatts of data centers that were leased to CoreWeave, along with the 500 million megawatts that were sent over for the mining infrastructure, right? That could either be repurposed or sold, and there'll be plenty of willing buyers for that. And this is really kind of the story behind the story, in that, what are they kind of acquiring? Yes, the chips, the infrastructure, all of that, but it's really, access to the grid, right? Because that is, in the end of the day, law of conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, or we all remember our Newtonian physics.
Exactly.
Right. So it's one of those things where it's going to be about access. We're looking at, an increase very, very quickly through the next 3 years, where, you're going to have 10% of the data center industry gobbling up all of the power, 10% of available power. So that is a very large number for a relatively specific use case, right? And I think that's one of those, they're going to be the have and have.
But you know what's going to happen? And this is what's fun, and it's, one of the things we focus on the C side of our business is power, right? Everybody does this linear extrapolation of how much power. So if we use this much power to power these data centers today, and we're going to build so many, we're going to need so much more power. And that's why, Microsoft, we're going to, start up 3 Mile Island again. Well, then these little, engineers in China at DeepSeek say, well, I can't get the chips. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to design software that uses these chips more effectively. And so I'm going to use less power, because I don't have to use many chips, to do the same or better. Well, then suddenly what happens is, well, now we don't have this linear, we got this degrading scale of power usage. And, like the company we invested in, where he's like, well, what if I took the processor and put it inside the memory, in-memory compute? Well, then the electrons wouldn't have to go as far, and we wouldn't need as much power, and then we wouldn't generate as much heat. Seems like a good idea. Or what if we use photons instead of electrons? And that has a different heat or energy demand. So the innovation's going to continue. It's kind of like, I remember growing up, people were saying, we're going to run out of X. Yeah. Right? We're going to run out of oil. Cars get, 8-10 miles to the gallon. There's only so many gallons available in the world. And so we're going to run out. Well, you haven't accounted for a couple of things. You haven't accounted for new technology will find more oil reserves, and new technology will make it more efficient. I used to tell the story all the time that there was this massive reserve of oil in the United States. It was bigger than Saudi Arabia, kind of Wyoming, Colorado, West Texas, but it was locked in shale. And literally the first way they tried to get it was they drill a hole a mile down and they'd put in this tungsten steel tube pipe and they'd heat it up to like 700 degrees and melt the hydrocarbons. Now, as you said, that just sounds expensive, right? That just sounds really expensive. So then some crazy, and I mean crazy in a good way, some crazy person said, well, what if we put a tube down there and forced sand, and then the sand would crack the shale? I'm like, come on. I mean, who thought that these little grains of sand could literally fracking anyway, but it worked. And now we're swimming in hydrocarbons and we're the largest oil producer in the world. And so the technology will continue to improve. And so we didn't run out of oil. In fact, we're probably never going to run out of oil. And we didn't run out of coal. We're not going to run out of coal. Now we're replacing coal with natural gas and other things. But the power demand is real right now because it's the tech we have. Mm-hmm. But as each iteration of technology improves, they'll be more power efficient and we'll use less power. So I'm actually, someone asked me a question just about uranium. Like, yeah, look, I think nuclear power is great. And in fact, I just read this morning, China just came up with this really interesting prototype. They take a container, it's the size of a container, like a container ship. And it's a nuclear reactor, a mini nuclear reactor, and they bury it underground, fully fueled, and it runs for about 10 years. And then it just stays buried, and now you've disposed of the waste because it's fully contained. Like, that's actually kind of a cool idea. But, that isn't commercially available yet, but it will. And so is that going to increase the demand for uranium? Sure. How long will it take to get, fully scaled? Take a little while, but at some point, and the one last one, the one that I still think is great, and someone's going to do this, is, right now we generate the power here to power the compute on the ground. And then we send the signals up onto the satellites and we bounce them back down and we have all that. Well, the sunlight up where the satellites are, super bright and super UV, super radiation heavy. What if we put little solar panels on a network of satellites and put the computers, put the data centers, mini data centers on the satellites, and did the compute where the power is and then beamed the results back down? That's pretty interesting. Now, doesn't exist yet, but someone's probably going to make that.
Yeah. And so one of the things, Mark, that you mentioned, which was but a mere footnote that I will double click on, is the idea of NVIDIA and part of the whole story here, right? A mere footnote.
A mere footnote for a $4 trillion company that I have been wrong about forever in terms of how high the stock could go. So full disclosure, I've been dead wrong.
The $4 trillion company, Mark. So, it was just on this show just a couple of short years ago. Okay. And actually last summer in June 2023, when they broke new ground and they became a $1 trillion company, right? And it was a lot of conversation that we had and said, well, look at the numbers here. The fundamentals just don't make that much sense. So, they've tripled in about a year, faster than Apple, faster than Microsoft. And, the only other U.S. firms with, by the way, market caps above 3 trillion. And so, what this shows is a remarkable rebound, right? If we look at like what happened, and I never thought, Mark, that I would talk about a $4 trillion company as one that is rebounding.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. After DeepSeek, there was this real fear that NVIDIA was just going to die, right? There was going to be too much competition abroad. They weren't really doing anything innovative relative to what others could do with seemingly inferior, chip quantities or chip capacities. And they're just better at the software creation, really. that has been, at least to today, a very bad bet, right? And so, since April in the lows, it has rebounded 74%, right? Some crazy number, which shows, the thesis that we always say, whether you can be wrong about an individual company, but still be right about the thesis, which is that people will want and need more data. They'll want and need more connections, not less. In the fact, Mark, and I think this is just an average use case, where we're talking about vacations, we're talking about barbecues. When you're with your family or with your friends and you're taking a picture, do we delete the pictures that we don't use? It's like, oh, let's just take another one. There must be 4 or 5 of the same picture before you have. I stopped doing that a long time ago because I just solved that problem by just getting a bigger iPhone, when it's time for my upgrade. It's like, yep, I was at 128. I'm going to go to 256. And sure enough, in a year or whatever, I'll probably go with the 512 because it's this idea that
32,744 photos on my phone, 32,774.
That's
and to your point, I took a dozen pictures of El Cap, right? Mm-hmm. One of the most amazing natural structures I have ever seen. And the idea that Alex Honnold climbed it without a rope. I mean, my stomach is turning just thinking about it. And I mean, just maybe the most incredible human feat of athleticism in history. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to delete the other 11. I should, because I just find the one I want. But that isn't the way it works. And you multiply that by the thousands of companies that are tracking every little thing, like every word I say it listens to, and Apple's keeping it all. I'm like, well, why? Because they're going to serve me an ad sometime. Okay, but I said that a month ago. I don't need that thing anymore. It does that, right? I'm sure this happens to you. Mm-hmm. You'll do a search. Like I did a search when I was in the market for my Kia, and I bought the Kia, and then it kept serving me ads for cars. I'm like, that's dumb. You I bought the Kia, right? You were listening to me when I was in the showroom. I bought the Kia, so stop serving me ads for cars. It's just a waste of power.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of those things where the AI, when I hear use cases like that, Mark, it just gives me, some kind of chutzpah to say NVIDIA may be a $10 trillion company at some day, because I don't see this fundamental concept changing of needing or requiring, less of connection. And then also, the reason that you're getting, my old world in the kind of the ad business on the tech side, it's one where, ad waste is a incentive that is passed along agencies and brands, right? The agencies are incentivized to spend as much as possible from the ad spend. They're not going to deliver it back to LG or back to Toyota and say, hey, you know what? We actually didn't use this. So why don't you go there? They say, no, we are graded on our performance on spending your money in the area you need to do it, right? And that, okay, great. Here's 10% more for next quarter.
The only thing that will change, and again, it's unlikely that it will be the incumbent. Mm-hmm. And so I will argue that the reason NVIDIA's stock has gone up so much is not so much people realizing that, oh, that product is so great and it's solving all these things. Yeah. To me, it's this passivization of investing through 401ks and 403bs and them all being capitalization weighted, meaning
7.3% of the S&P 500 is just NVIDIA, right?
So every week when your money goes into the S&P index, it must buy 7.3% of NVIDIA. Right. And then next week it'd be 7.35 and then 7.4. And so that to me is the real issue around, the US stock market today, the financialization of it. It's bigger at 64 trillion than all the other major markets around the world combined. Every market in Europe, every market in Asia, Japan, all of them put together are 62 trillion. Mm-hmm. And the US is 64. So it's illogical that, and I showed a picture yesterday, the PE ratio So Goldman Sachs does this thing of the forward PE. So I would say the price to fantasy, right? The future earnings, which actually never happen, and they keep lowering them so they can beat them. But the future earnings, they have a range, and it's got the median, and it's got the quartiles, and it's got the top and the bottom. We're now above at over 21 times forward earnings any recorded number we've ever had. And so, well, okay, but that can't last forever. Well, no, it can't. And it will eventually go, but I don't know what the catalyst is. Someone asked me, what's the catalyst? I said, I don't know. So that process is very different than, I believe, someone, and I hope it's a company we invest in, at least someone is going to, and maybe it's Grok even, right, come up with a set of chips that don't use as much power, that don't require all of the data to be live and active. I mean, Snowflake's actually working on this type of stuff where they let you put your data over here and only pay for it when you need it. And so they're becoming an AI company as opposed to a data warehouse and data lake company. Mm-hmm. And so I think all of this innovation around how because it should, meaning it meaning AI, should be able to tell that I don't need the car ads anymore. And as that car ages, and again, it knows, because every time I get in the car, I connect, it knows how many miles are on the car. So at some point, it should then start sending me information about a new car, but not today. And so there's tons of things, like I say, Pandora and Amazon, I think have the best AIs. I just think they're amazing. I mean, they serve me things that are useful every single day.
Right. And we've made the people wait long enough, Mark. And before we lose steam, we need to pivot into the chart of the week, but it won't be too harsh of a pivot because we've already been talking about, the NVIDIA dominance, but just to illustrate it in potentially, one of the chart crimes, which is just the sheer audacity of some of these numbers. I'll say that. Yeah. And I will share the screen, Mark, and as per usual, I will give a brief summary and let you share some thoughts and opine about just how ridiculous some of this growth is in the public markets, really. And just to kind of, for those that are on audio only, we do this over on YouTube. So check us out and you can see, all of the nice visuals that we put up at the end of the show. And as well as, if we're matching today, we're going with the blue with color. And really, some crazy stats here that we're showing kind of this race to 4 trillion. And let's also not lose this stat as well, which is very easy to talk about one company, but the company that they keep are also no slouches themselves, which also heavily dependent upon AI. So to your point, maybe you're right, Mark. Maybe there will be an adjustment in NVIDIA, and that will mean the growth for another company. But before that happens, it's worth remarking about some of their stats, right? So they reported a total revenue of $44 billion in the fourth quarter. That is almost a 70% jump, and we're expecting $45 billion for this quarter. And really what that looks like, Mark, in terms of just like how big that is and what it represents for their company, NVIDIA is now worth more than the combined values of our two closest neighbors' stock markets. Canada and the Mexico stock market, it's worth more than that. And oh, by the way, it's also larger than the total value of all publicly listed companies in the United Kingdom, which is a G7 company. So, with that, Mark, as your setup.
Look, I mean, it's appropriate that the NVIDIA line is green, right? For money. It has been money good. And, we got Apple in red and Microsoft in blue here. And what's amazing is in 2023, which is not like 100 years ago. Okay. In 2023, NVIDIA had fallen by about 50% in the previous 12 months. Okay. It had gone from just under $1 trillion to, about 400 billion. So that's a big deal, right? A company value fell in half. But at the same time, Apple had gone from a 3 trillion to 2 trillion, so it had fallen by a third. And Microsoft had fallen from 2.5 to 1.5, which is about 40%. So, it was a tough market, right? That was the bear market following the peak in everything in November of 21. And so there were a lot of people calling for the end of the world. But then the chart just goes totally parabolic. I mean, it literally looks like the Bitcoin chart or the Ethereum chart or the Solana chart. I mean, it just goes from 500 to a billion in about 6 months. And then, consolidated, to a trillion with a T. But then it adds a trillion in 3 months.
Insane.
And then it adds another trillion in another 3. I mean, this thing just went totally, totally parabolic. And then it has a DeepSeek moment and it sheds, about 500 billion. So again, as big as it was 2 short years ago. And then it just surges 40+% from 2.5 to 4 in the past 4 or 5 months. Why? Well, lots of different reasons. I mean, the biggest is this passive aggressive, so to speak, in terms of buying. But look, it is remarkable for any company, right, to generate $45 billion of sales in a quarter, in 90 days. It's remarkable. And even if they don't keep it up, it's still remarkable. But let's say they keep it up and that, turns into $180 billion of revenue over the next 12 months. Okay, let's go back to in the good old days, stocks traded 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 times revenues, right? If you were a really, really great company, maybe you got to 5. So let's round the, 180 to 200, just to be nice, to make the math easier, and then multiply by 5. That gets you $1 trillion. Okay. Now, in 2000, a bunch of companies like Sun Microsystems and Oracle, your old stomping ground, and Microsoft got to 10 times. And, the president of Sun, said, look, guys, to pay me 10 times my revenue means I basically have to give you all my revenue for the next decade for you to make a decent return, which is a problem because I'd go to jail because I'd have to pay taxes and my employees, my suppliers. So that's not going to happen. And his stock went down 98%. Now, I'm not saying NVIDIA is going down 98%. That's not my point. The point is that 10 times is ludicrous. And from 2000 to 2002, all those 10 times revenue companies fell 84% down back to 2 times, which is kind of what a good company used to sell for. Well, at 4 trillion on 180, well, Mark, that's way higher than 10 times. Yeah, that's the problem. And let's say they could grow 70% a year for the next 5 years. That it's probably not going to happen, but let's just pretend that it could. And you went from that 45. So let's just quickly do that math. Mm-hmm. So 1.7 to the 5th power would be 14 times. So 14 times 45. So they'd have $600 billion of revenue in a quarter.
Wow.
In 5 years. Okay. Let's just think about that. Is that possible? I mean, is there anyone alive that could spend 600 billion in a quarter?
The only thing close to that, Mark, you would basically have to double what Amazon does in a day. Amazon is the highest revenue, and that's 1 billion a day. So 356.25 billion in a year. But that's consumables, right? And that's across all.
So you have to do 2 times Amazon's revenue in 1 quarter.
In one quarter, yeah.
Let's just say it's probably not going to happen.
Right.
I'm a betting man. If someone wants to take the other side of that, I will take the bet. So anyone listening, if you want to take the other side of that and you think that NVIDIA can grow at 70% compounded for the next 5 years, okay, I will take that bet. So they're probably not going to. So, but what could they grow? I mean, could they get to 100 billion a quarter? Nah, maybe. I mean, even that seems tough because here's the thing. Once Microsoft buys a bunch of chips to make their data center, they don't have to upgrade every year.
Right.
They certainly do it every quarter, but they don't have to upgrade every year. And so, yeah, Saudi is going to give Grok a couple $2 billion to buy chips. That's great, right? From zero revenue to a couple billion. Okay, that's great. But they're not saying they're going to do 100 billion. So I just think there's this linear extrapolation of something that isn't linear. And my guess is there'll be more DeepSeek moments where people are using fewer chips and better software to do the same things. But for now, we have this beautiful chart of this beautiful parabolic move. Now, the chart we should have next to it, there's the classic bubble chart, right? Which looks just like this, right? It has the initial ramp and then a fall in the early days. And then it goes totally parabolic and it rolls over at the top. And then it goes in what's called the back to normal phase. Mm-hmm. And then it rolls over and goes, and again, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but
in that phrase that you mentioned, Mark, on the back to normal moment, when we were thinking about, the core acquisition, one of the things that I found interesting was the notion we talk about cost savings and why that's a good idea, for CoreWeave to buy Core because they're going to save money on power. Okay. So it was considered a good deal because they were only paying 18 times PE forward multiples, Mark. And that was considered a good deal, right? So we're kind of in this new era of consumption. And, as we kind of consider these companies, TSMC, which is in some ways the heart or the fuel, it is Core to CoreWeave. It is, TSMC to NVIDIA, the beta to their Omega. And the idea that, they have had a really, really good quarter. I think they had, they had around 9 billion or so was the revenue. And they basically lost, some share. It was like 0.9% down in their performance. And so there is this asymmetry and there's really a premium to go with your oil analogy, to quote the old boss, Big Red, Larry Ellison, data is the new oil. So oil is kind of useless in its raw form. It's the refinement. So I think that there is this divergence that's happening, Mark, between kind of the core chip makers, which would be a TSMC, the Samsungs of the world, the Microns, et cetera, Intel, right? And that is going away. That value is getting reduced or transferred, let's say, to the refining companies like the NVIDIAs or even, the app players like Meta and or, Microsoft. And I think that's a really interesting, fascination because one of the comments that we were thinking about as we spent a lot of time in Middle East is that, global conflicts are okay because the price of petroleum is above $50 a barrel. Are we going to get to the world when we think about a tech index? Tech is okay because the price of NVIDIA or the price of TSMC is X. Is it going to be that much of a commodity? Because we just can't live without oil. We cannot live without AI. And, that'll be...
That's, again, it's a perfect analogy and exactly right. And look, there's no question that right now people will pay any price to get their hands on these chips because the perception is if you don't have them, you fall behind and you can't compete and you'll lose share and you'll lose revenue. And I would say in the short term, that's true. I mean, we're seeing it. But I am confident that there will be innovation either in processing and or storage and or power efficiency, whatever, that will change this dynamic. And you won't be willing to pay $50,000 for a Blackwell. You'll say, I want the $10,000 version. And people say, no, look at AMD versus Intel. AMD always struggled. It was always an also-ran. Sure, but they sold a lot of chips. You know, there are a lot of computers that are powered by AMD chips. And AMD then pivoted into GPUs. And yeah, they're a poor second, you know, to NVIDIA, but they still exist and they still do lots of revenue. So there will be substitutes. There will be new innovations. And I think this is there's something called a gamma knife. It's a total non sequitur. There's this really cool technology called a gamma knife. And so if you have something wrong with a blood vessel in your head, they literally put this thing on your head, and then they have these lasers pointed from all these different directions with radiation. And any one beam causes no damage to your cells. Any two beams crossing, no damage to your cells. But when you get, I don't remember the number, if it's 10 or 15, but when you get enough radiation in a single point, it cauterizes the cell or kills the cancer.
Wow.
That's unbelievable, right? I mean, it's unbelievable that you can fire lasers into your brain and take a little tiny vein and cauterize it so it doesn't bleed out and you don't die. Unbelievable. But that usage of technology was an innovation around a problem that needed to be solved. And I think the same thing is happening now in that you have this confluence of events like these radiation beams that cause a good company with a good product to be overweight in an index where all the money's flowing in an index. But us boomers, right? Proud boomer, you know, second to last year, are going to start withdrawing, right? The people at the beginning of the boom, the 46, 47, 48, 49, they're going to have to start living on that savings. And so they're going to start pulling out, and the millennial generation doesn't put as much in just because they don't make as much as the boomers are going to be pulling out. So at some point, there's going to be this outflow from the indices, and the virtuous cycle of buying 7.3% NVIDIA is going to turn into the vicious cycle of having to sell. And again, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but over some period of time, there will be a net outflow. Now, the one way to combat this, which I don't like, is you print tons and tons of money so that the new money that's going in seems to be worth more, even though it's worth less because there's more of them, than the old money coming out. And that actually might be the plan. So I don't love that plan, but that actually might be the plan, because that's really Japan proved this. It's your only way out, right, is to devalue your currency like crazy, which causes your equity value, but bringing it all back to Bitcoin. In that world, Bitcoin is measured in millions.
Yeah. And
it's really interesting. Well, Bloomberg now lists Bitcoin 0.116 million.
Wow. That's amazing. And I think, that's why, Mark, we're so interested and passionate about the ABCDs, because it is, as a venture investor, both a way to grow your net asset value in the present as well in the future, because we are living in the future in terms of what we rely upon. But Mark, there is not enough time for us to catch up on the weeks that we missed. So I'm glad we're going to be bringing it back next week. And we want to thank everybody for tuning in. And we have a couple of other podcasts that are coming with great guests that we've got slotted, and more of that over the coming weeks. And we just want to remind our listeners, as always, rate, review, subscribe, keep supporting the show, and as always, to stay current. Thank you for joining us this week on Digital Currents. Check out our links to our website and social media in the show's description box. Please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
This podcast should not be construed as investment advice nor solicitation for the sale of any security, advisory, or other service. Investment themes and ideas discussed may be owned by funds managed by the host and podcast guests. Any conflicts at the time of production have been mentioned by the host but are subject to change. Listeners should consult their personal financial advisors before making any investment decisions.